Good afternoon. This is the tough time right after lunch. How are we doing? I like the thumbs up. I'm Laura Lunsford. I'm here to help you think about some practices in terms of effective mentorship. How many of you were here this morning? Okay, so you kind of know who I am. You don't need a new bio, except for I do a lot of workshops like this all over the country, especially for faculty members. How many of you are faculty in some sort of faculty role? How many of you are more, you would think of yourself more as a mentee role, postdoc, resident? Okay, so we have a bit of a mix. Any other category of folks? I have some new friends who are passing around some handouts. I have a couple of handouts for the workshop that just might give you some information to think about. And I have a general scheme here, but I also want to be really responsive to questions or pain points that you might have. I was just having a wonderful conversation at lunch with a couple of faculty to triage some ways to do some mentorship better. Here's my basic goal here is recognizing some processes and behaviors, recognizing and reducing dysfunctional mentoring, having a framework for powerful questions, how to ask that, so more listening, less talking, and how to ask really good questions, and motivating with positive emotions. These are sort of my goal. Is there another topic anyone would hope we might address? We're on track. I asked this earlier today. We got some answers about mentoring is, some of the other behaviors. I'm wondering if anyone would add anything to that, like what else do you think mentoring is, or how is it different from coaching? Because I imagine a lot of you do coaching in your roles.
Mentoring is a lifelong commitment.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Coaching is just a certain time.
A momentary blip, lifelong. It sounds like we're going to be married forever. Anyone else? What do you think? How is coaching different? Do you endorse that thinking? Okay, why are you saying no? What would you amend?
I would wonder, it's hard for me to imagine lifelong, and so it would be easier for me to imagine, a certain phase. How can we get, through this current set of goals, or from point A to point B, or to begin the process with the goal of maybe achieving certain things, but then finding what mentorship you need at a later point in time, or something like that.
Okay, so maybe not lifelong, but longer than coaching, probably. Often mentoring can be lifelong, especially if started at seminal points in people's transitions and people's careers, and some of my work has suggested that. They even consider themselves an academic family. They stay in touch. How many of you stay in touch with your PhD advisors? Mine recently retired. We still go drink beer, sometimes on Fridays. So we certainly have stayed in touch. And coaching is much more skills focused and generally short term. I don't know that mentoring has to be lifelong. One way that's helpful to think about it, maybe you have to be I shared this definition earlier, and here's another way to think about it. Not therapy. I was just talking to some faculty members who feel like sometimes their mentees are expecting a little bit of that. How many of you have had that experience? Feel like some counseling's involved. It's not only supervising, advising, guiding, and coaching, so those are really important behaviors, but it's not only that. And I like to think of it in terms of the role, the process, and then the specific behavior. In other words, sometimes you're assigned to a role, and people feel immediately that that's a mentoring relationship. You have a trainee, you have a postdoc, you have a graduate student. But just because you're in that initially doesn't mean that you feel like it's a mentoring relationship. It evolves over time like many relationships. And I think focusing in on what are these key behaviors, and for psychosocial, listening is an important criteria, and confidence building. How much of the time do you think that you should be talking in a mentoring conversation? Percentage. Somebody said that. How much is that? Is that 25%? 20, 25? How many people think it should be more than that? No one? What do you think? You want them to talk more and you to talk less? Okay. Anybody yes. Okay. More conversational. How many are more in the 50-50? How many people would endorse that ratio? Okay, we've got some support there. The literature is not exactly clear on the right specific amount, other than to say it should not be more than 50%. And that's something to just monitor as you're having conversations. If you're in the mentoring role and you're speaking more, probably stop. Just stop. That would be my advice, is to stop doing that. If you're a mentee, there should be some expectation that we need to hear you thinking more, and the challenge can be sometimes if you're the mentee and the person's talking a lot and you're not feeling like you're getting value, is how to interject there a little bit. In terms of the career behaviors, the collaboration, I talked about this morning. Collaboration seems to be what carries relationships forward. And figuring out how to collaborate appropriately on a research project, a paper, whatever is the purpose of that mentoring relationship is extremely important in terms of effectiveness and sponsorship. It's interesting, I've done a lot of work talking with military populations, and they have a regulation for everything. Anyone been in the military here? There's a US Army regulation, for example, on mentorship. And sponsorship is excluded, interestingly, because there's a perception of we want to be fair, but the reality is, even when I go to the Army War College, there is sponsorship. It is a part of what mentoring is about, especially in your context, is to approve someone, whether that's with a letter of recommendation, recommending them for an activity that they might not have thought about, and being much more intentional about active sponsorship, especially for underrepresented populations. I'm trying to remember now, is it McKinsey? I think it's McKinsey and Company. They have a new challenge to mentor more women to get to the C-suite. How much time a week do you think they're committing to this? They've asked all executives to make this commitment. How much time would you think it takes to mentor women? Anyone? Like, no idea? What would you say if you wanted to mentor women to get ahead, how much time do you think that would take out of your week? Oh, this.
Depends on what background the individual person has, what experience they've got, what their goals are. It's hard to believe there's one perfect number or perfect outcome.
Spoken like a true. You're academic. Are you academic? Yes, ish. McKinsey would disagree. They say it's a very specific number, and the number is 36 minutes a week. And I share this with you to say there's just sometimes ideas we can get from other settings. And the way they parse this in 3 categories. 30 minutes is to have lunch once a week with a junior up-and-coming woman to just learn what her goals are, what she's about. Once a week to do this. 5 minutes a week to speak to another junior female colleague and find out some accomplishment she has in the last, month, quarter. And then 1 minute a week telling another high-level person about her accomplishment. So they have operationalized sponsorship to 36 minutes a week and have found some success in this because they were finding that women especially were not being... people weren't bragging about their accomplishments. We know women are more reluctant to share those, and this really institutionalized that practice and has made a difference in women feeling equipped and wanting to apply for those positions. So it's just something to think about when we think about how to be specific. Things do depend, certainly, but being intentional is part of what they're doing and what I'm suggesting to think about these behaviors. There's also something called micro-mentoring. Has anyone heard of this before, micro-mentoring? I have a colleague out of Wisconsin who does this work. So not everything has to be this lifelong relationship, but having an approach to even one interaction being more mentor-like. Over time, these micro episodes might develop into mentoring and informal situations, but the approach of just having a conversation that's mentor-like rather than telling, and so just sort of thinking as that as part of your culture and how you operate when you're working, especially with junior folks. Mentorship, like many relationships, unfolds in stages, and I draw your attention to this just to think a little bit about how you might want to start. How you behave at the beginning should be different than the middle and at the end. And I like acronyms, so I have ICE. So the initiation stage is really that, and you've got forms to support that, those mentoring agreements, development plans. You're building rapport and trust and setting some goals. How are people going to be different through this relationship than if they weren't in it? That collaboration is right in the middle, the cultivation stage. The work is getting done. And what people really neglect is the ending stage, especially for formal mentoring situations, and many of you have those, is how are we going to reflect on what was learned? What kind of relationship might we have going forward? How might you invite people to transition to a new, more collegial relationship? Your expectations of what they might do as mentors in the future. So sort of that wrapping up and moving on. Sometimes we're very happy to move on without us. I've had a few of those kinds of mentees. I'm very happy. I'm happy to consider that person a former colleague. You guys are not awake yet. Not a current colleague. But there's time, it's okay for things to end, especially for formal, but just having that conversation about, I wish you well, let me know if you need something, or good luck in your new role, being more intentional about how you want that to unfold. I'd like to do a little thought experiment about high quality and just looking at our time. So the first handout gives you that National Academy's definition of mentoring. But I want you just to think for a moment, I've listed some signature behaviors there. What behavior do you most emphasize or wish to emphasize in your mentorship? Just take 60 seconds, jot it down, tell somebody next to you. Discern and affirm, we didn't talk about. Discerning is figuring out what people might be hoping for. And sometimes it takes some discernment because maybe the person isn't quite sure. Part of what it is they're trying to figure out the options. What do you think is most important in your practice or you would like to do more of? I have some handouts for those who came in late. Does anyone need one? I made some friends this morning, so I'm going to call on them to tell me what they would select. So what would you select? He was like, okay, I don't want to humiliate you publicly. How about you? Did you have one, Antonio? Yeah. What is it? No, okay, he's crying now.
Repeat the question, sorry.
Okay, yes, what's yours?
So mine would be at least starting off with goal setting.
Goal setting.
Because lots of times in our relationships, they're somewhat hierarchical, and the senior person may have ideas of what their goals are for someone, but we haven't really necessarily agreed on a common definition of what those goals might be.
Okay, yeah. You might have some expectations that may vary from what theirs might be. How many put goal setting? How many are sort of like, that's one of my top ones? What? Did you have time to think? Yes.
I would agree. I would say goal setting is pretty important, but I guess since I haven't had the experience of being a mentor to anyone as of yet, because I'm still pretty young, but I think as a mentee, I think definitely just having similar values is pretty important to me, at least because from the clinical aspect, I think I want to emulate the characteristics of potential mentors who are successful in their careers. So whatever kind of characteristic, whatever qualities or character traits that they have.
Okay, so I'm going to just summarize. I should have brought a mic. I'm a very bad facilitator. It's a big group. This idea of more aligning values, finding someone who has some values that you would like to make sure are clear to other people, that might be your most important thing to figure out early on in that relationship, and maybe goals would be secondary to that or flow from that. Yes? Say more about trust.
I think a relationship where you feel like you can be honest with that mentor and have the space to do that without judgment about what your goals are or what you're struggling with.
Okay, so having trust I like the no judgment. Actually, in my labs, it was about 10 years ago now, we literally made a no judgment zone. Like, we made a circle on the floor, and like you could step in it and not be judged for whatever ridiculous thing that they felt they were asking, or maybe sometimes that I would be saying. Thank you for helping out with that. Anybody else have trust at the top? See, I feel like mentor is more like the goal setting. It's just something to think about when you start those relationships, is what is important to you may or may not be as important to your relational partner, and thinking a little bit about what they value as a way to build some of that trust and listen to what they're saying. All right, high quality, I'm going to do a thought experiment. Imagine someone who you enjoy seeing walking towards you. You leave here and you see that person. 3 adjectives to describe them. What come to mind right away? You could just shout them out. We're going to have to be fast. What's one? You see them. You like seeing this person. What comes to mind? What's a characteristic?
Good sense of humor.
Good sense of humor. What is it?
Confident.
Oh, confident.
Charismatic.
Charismatic. Fun. What's yours? You see them. You like them. Don't overthink it. Adjective.
Caring.
Caring.
And curious.
Curious. What's yours? Loyal.
Encouraging.
Encouraging.
Reciprocal.
Reciprocal.
Happy.
Happy. I like the happy people. Okay, so you did all right on this. Okay, now we're going to do another thought experiment. You ready? If you see them again, it will be too soon. What's a word that comes to mind?
Energy sucker.
All the time.
Okay, negative, energy sucker, judgment, unkind, disappointing,
Make it all about them.
rude, make it all about yourselves, cold, closed, confrontational. Do you observe what just happened? Do you see how fast you were on the second kind of person? The negative is extremely memorable. And none of you even hesitated. You're all hesitating on the good, like, wait, let me get the right word. We want our mentees or our relationships to feel more like the first example and not the second. And I am completely confident that there's people who left my office before feeling like the second. It's just going to be that way. Even great mentors have bad days. But the question is, how can you in your relationships have more interactions like the first one and far fewer like the second, especially if you're giving critical feedback, which is an exceptionally important aspect of mentorship. So this idea about tensility, openness, and emotional tone, which I spoke about earlier today, provides some guidelines of how to do that. I did some work with faculty mentoring relationships. So we interviewed hundreds of faculty and assistant, associate, and full professors and asked them if they were in mentoring relationships, they were the mentor or the mentee, and to the extent that they expressed had this high relationship quality. It went up to 7. So you can see for the mentee, they are a little bit more likely to feel that they could express their feelings, good or bad. They felt that they could count more on their mentor after difficult conversations and think about new ideas. The mentor scores were a little bit lower. These are all statistically significant. Why do you think mentors would be more reluctant to share? Maybe when things didn't go well, or why do you think? Yes, that's exactly what it was. That they felt that if they shared when it didn't go well, that it might be looking like they weren't as competent a person to be a mentor. And yet, In this work, we actually collected a lot of information on job satisfaction and engagement at work, and the people who had higher scores reported more job satisfaction. And job satisfaction is tied to retention, which is also incredibly important. So if you start thinking about this and unwrapping it, it's like, well, the higher the quality of the relationship, which we can measure. Sometimes people look at quality as an outcome, and I was very interested in the middle as a predictor. When you look at that, the outcomes matter a lot, and they're a lot better for people who report higher quality than low quality. And so as mentors, sometimes thinking about it might be okay to disclose, not in great detail. I once did a workshop at Arizona State University, and the person said, okay, so I shouldn't be telling them about the 47 rejections I got on my dissertation. I'm like, yeah, no one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear this long story about and how you finally got it published. So you do have to kind of think a little bit about it becoming a war story versus an encouragement, or just this is a time it didn't go well and here's how I overcame it. But disclosing some of that is something I would encourage you to think about, and how to build some of that emotional tone, celebrating successes and also recognizing when things are difficult. Do any of you have a particular practice when you start a lab meeting or mentoring meeting that gives a moment for people to share, like, what's something that's good that's happened? Does anyone do that? See a few head nods. Do you have a question that you ask? No? Do you have one that you ask? Oh, wait, we're rescuing your voice with this mic right there, yes.
I'm sorry. From the Frontiers Leadership Group and staff, we spend a few minutes to give kudos to somebody else in the group.
Oh, kudos, okay.
Week. Yeah.
So, that's a great idea. I would encourage you here, I will hold on to it, so I'll be a better, since you're all stretched out back here. I was supposed to tell you to move to the front. I'm not a very good facilitator, as I said. So I would encourage you to be more intentional about that, because it builds a lot of that emotional tone, and sharing a kudo about somebody else is one really powerful way to do that. Other tips are, hey, everyone just go around and share one good thing that happened since we last met. And it doesn't have to be professional, because this is a way for you just to show that you are interested and know about what else is going on in people's lives. And it can be short. It doesn't have to be long, but it builds a sense of camaraderie that becomes incredibly important then when you need to give critical feedback. And they feel like you know them. And it generates some positive emotions, which we'll talk about. So being intentional about building those in are something I hope you'll think about in terms of relationship quality, because we want to reduce dysfunction. And one of the other things we know from mentoring scholarship is that, let's say I am mentoring you. What's your name? Bianca? With a V. With a V, Bianca. We've been together for a year and we were both surveyed about how often we met, it's not even highly correlated what we will both report. Now, I think it should be, right? You should know how often we met, roughly, right? It should line up with what I think. People's perceptions differ even when they're in that same relationship, and in terms of what seems to matter. I spoke earlier this morning about interviewing scientists in Australia, and I never used the word mentoring in the study, and what was so interesting to me is that when you asked them about the behaviors that were important to them as a student, they talked about career kinds of behaviors. When you ask them about what behaviors do they find to be most important now as they're mentoring graduate students and postdocs, they talked about psychosocial kinds of behaviors. So probably both were happening, but what seemed important or what was taking up more time differ. And being intentional and thinking about that in terms of dysfunction can be very important. One of the conversations I was having earlier today was about mismatch. Some residents come in expecting something, but it's really not a match maybe with what that person's prepared to do, and recognizing that early and making some course corrections are important. Or lack of expertise. They come in and they're not prepared maybe to do the writing or the research skills that are necessary. So figuring out some ways to address that early on, because then it's just an exercise in frustration. And we know that especially for underrepresented folks, these experiences can be derailing. And I think in part explain some of the long times to degree and attrition from degrees. So thinking very intentionally to let people know that these are common sources of dysfunction and how to get rid of them. And neglect is one I am sometimes guilty of. How many of you have done that? You've answered a call when somebody's sitting right there with you. Am I the only one? So it's okay to do that, but you need to warn people that that might happen, because otherwise they're just feeling like they're not important. And it's even, I'm disrobed of my phone at the moment because apparently it interferes with the mic, but normally I have it on. Most people have it on them, and it's just a natural thing, but it comes off as neglect. So just thinking intentionally about how to reduce those signals is important. And so all of those, that's on that second page, is thinking a little bit about that. How many of you have a plan for your first meeting with mentees or mentors? Okay. Like, not enough of you. I would encourage you to have plans for that first meeting. Like, how's that going to go? What's your intention for that? And thinking very specifically about having an early first conversation about communication preferences and styles and expectations. So one tip I have adopted is what must-haves, can't-stands. Does anybody do something like that for your first meeting or when you're bringing people on? Must-have, can't-stand. I give it to everyone in advance. In our first meeting, we say, here's what I really must have in working with others. And in my case, I don't mind if they miss the deadline. I mind if I find out about it after the deadline. So I must have some advance notice. Can't stand, sometimes they're the same thing. I also can't stand that. I know, I'm just walking around. Yes?
Oh, I'll do it.
Okay, good.
Gotta earn my keep.
I award you the keeper of the microphone.
Raise your hand.
But what it does is it lets you, and we store it, so then when students or mentees make a little mishap, you can kind of just pull it back up and go, let's reset about what everybody's expecting. And it also helps you know what they expect, how to communicate. I don't read my text. They text me. They expect that I will answer those texts. I call them, they don't answer. Right? You need to sort of sort out some of that stuff, because they don't understand why I don't answer their texts at 11 at night sometimes, because they're working on a project. So thinking a bit about how to align that helps you reduce some of that dysfunction. That can be quite important. All right, I want to focus sort of on this, and then we'll have some time for questions. Increasingly, and I think the research really shows this, the skill of effective mentorship is asking good questions. The right questions, high-value questions. My colleagues in Europe think they do a much better job at this than we do in the United States. They find it still to be quite hierarchical here. We argue about that. Like, really? You've got a king and a queen, you know? If any Brits, we can talk about it after. So here is sort of the framework, and it's on the third handout page. And I'm just going to walk us through this and focus a little bit more on the listening part. Intention, and again, a lot of what I'm suggesting is just being much more intentional in your relationship. So this is for mentees and mentors. Like, why are you meeting? What's your intention? And typically they're going to fall under three areas. It's future focus, planning. It's going to be on an outcome, the paper that we're writing, or it's going to be on commitment, like how we're working together, how something's going to unfold, more process. And helping people by saying that what your intention is helps guide how that conversation is going to go. Like, my intention today is that you leave here with one idea about something you might do a little bit differently. Like, having that kind of conversation with your mentees or mentors is really important. I'm willing to get to know you enough to explore these things together. Building rapport really is about seeing you. All of this business about identity, and I've done some workshops, and sometimes, I even teach it, and it's hard to keep up. There's lots of different ways. When I moved to Arizona, I was familiar from living in North Carolina, for example, with Cherokee and Lumbee populations. American Indian populations are all very different too. But we lump them in one category, and I can't possibly keep up. So really, a lot of this rapport is, I see you, I want to know what's important to you, and be here to help you achieve that success. And vice versa, mentees kind of need to see their mentors. So following some curiosity, but not in an interrogation kind of way. And I've learned now to start many questions with, I'm curious about. It just sounds a lot better than why. Just eradicate why from your vocabulary. It puts people on the defensive. It doesn't sound as good, but I'm curious sounds safe. Well, I'm curious about this. For example, I had a mentee once. We had a paper accepted. I'd registered for the conference. She hadn't done it. I couldn't understand. We'd been talking about it for 2 months. So I kind of checked myself for a moment, and I just said, well, I'm curious as to why you haven't registered yet. And she said, well, I don't have a credit card. Now, I'm first generation. I kind of should have thought about that. But I've been, brainwashed into the academy where everybody has credit cards. What do you mean you don't have a credit card? So it was a very easy problem to solve. But if I'd said, why haven't you done this, right? That just sounds like you've done something wrong and maybe makes her embarrassed not to be able to tell me the truth to solve a very simple problem. So thinking about, I'm curious, connecting first before you're sort of exploring really makes a difference. And here, if you feel like it, have a challenge. If you need to work in this area, just 3 people you don't know, try to establish some rapport with them in the next week. I made friends. See, we made friends with these guys back here who are like sort of paying attention and getting worried because I'm walking back here again. You're safe. You're totally safe. Openness. What's the opposite of openness? Closed. What does that look like? What did you say? Retracted. Not interested? Not listening? Yes, it's often, I already know what you're going to say, so I start responding to it. I interrupt you, so I'm not letting you finish. This is one of my weaknesses I always have to work on. It's like, I know where you're headed with this, but I have to wait, because maybe they're not going that way. So being open to unscripted, what's happening, not being an interrogator. I've seen this happen. Sometimes you're trying to problem solve. So you start problem solving rather than help supporting them to solve or figuring it out. Again, what and how, not why. Just get rid of why. If I was queen of the universe, I would strike why from our vocabulary. It doesn't come out well in mentoring conversations. People feel very attacked when you ask why. What do you listen for? When you're listening to either your mentor or mentees, what do you listen for?
What they don't say.
Okay, what they don't say is actually very important. Anyone else do that? What they don't say? People have different styles. I tend to be I'm going to just throw you in and figure out what you can and can't do, and then it doesn't go well, but now I know what they can and can't do. Like what they're not. I'm like, well, this is supposed to be hard, actually, so let's back up. You do know how to do this, but not this part. People have different styles about that. What else do you listen for? Passion? Yeah, what gets them excited?
Body language.
I actually sometimes I worked with a guy who worked with the FBI who was like a body language expert. This is like, I'm not listening to you. Like it's hard to check out here, and women cross their legs a lot. They try to be little. So asking people even if you're in a meeting, especially if it's one-on-one and they're like this, you really should ask them to uncross their arms. They're just blocked. It actually matters how their relationship will go. Yes?
I listen because I care about my mentees. I listen because I care about my mentees.
Okay.
Wanted to see their side of the story before I pitch in.
Okay. You want to see how they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes we listen for confirmation of our opinions or approval or the next action, especially mentees, what's wrong. And so, again, this idea of realizing maybe that's happening and thinking about how to ask more about what are you curious to know more about, rather than finishing a sentence or looking for your mentor to verify that you're correct. A lot of work I do with mentors is how to think about, let me try to put this in another way. Every relationship involves two people. When someone's doing something you don't like, you should look at what you're doing. Because we usually want to say, they're doing this, they're doing that. And it's like, well, but what are you doing to encourage that behavior? And how could you do something different to redirect that to a different behavior? Yes, we have okay, Julius, you're on board.
I am working. Tell my bosses.
I'm listening for new perspectives. So especially as I have power in institutions and in my work environment, I'm trying to understand other perspectives that I may not have lived experiences with.
That's a really good thing to listen for, and it's hard to listen for that because we tend to want to evaluate it. Will you go back over there, please?
Yes.
I wonder how you do that so it doesn't feel evaluative. Like if it's something you just think it's the craziest thing you've ever heard, how do you not say that in some way?
Well, mostly I worry about coming off as somebody, like I recognize my own privilege, and I want to come from a place of being, of humility, and it's hard. And I have messed it up all the time, and when I say something that comes off in a weird way, I just say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I'm still learning, I'm trying to grow, or something like that.
That's really important, actually, because sometimes when we say things we think we've said it wrong and we're a little embarrassed, the other person can interpret it as they did something wrong. So by actually saying, oh, I don't quite have the right language around this, or I'm not quite sure I handled that right, you have made it easier for them to not blame themselves, especially with different perspectives. That's very hard to do. I once was working with a bunch of teachers on an exercise to listen to different perspectives, and I'm watching the room, and they were in a group, and literally the mentee was talking, and I saw him stop talking. So I went over and I said, what just happened? And he had proposed a different idea, and a teacher just started shaking their head. They actually didn't say anything. And I said, well, why did you shake your, because I said, why did you stop talking? He's like, well, I saw her shake her head. I was like, well, tell me why you were doing that. Well, because I know it won't work. So nothing was actually said. Do you see what I mean? But just the body language just shut that, and I could see it from across the room. So it's very difficult to do that, but excellent that you're doing that. So thinking about listening and how you can be curious, maybe even like, well, I'm curious why you're thinking that. I think sometimes people feel like they need to have an answer right then or have an evaluation, and we really don't need that. Just listening. What about, this just makes me also think about, if people tell you some negative feedback, what is the best response? I'm so proud. I'm so happy. Yes, thank you. People don't know that. They want to defend or explain, and you should really not ever do that, because the moment you do that, they're never going to give you any critical feedback again, especially if you're the mentor. So learning to say, I appreciate that. Thank you for telling me that. Doesn't mean you agree. It just means you're appreciative that they felt that they could express it. Here's some other just sort of tips, if this is a newer thing for you to think about. Some reflective listening, and this is what I liked about what you said, connect the unsaid. This part of the mentor job is to connect those dots, like filling in that picture about maybe what's not said that's important, what got left off. So here's some things like, you believe this, sounds like from your perspective, I'm understanding this is what you want to do, or where you want to head, or why you're frustrated, etc. Empathy is also important, and people get confused between empathy and sympathy. So there's apathy, which is the neglect, like I don't care, get out of my office, I'm busy. Those are the facts. You told me the thing, now goodbye. Sympathy is about feelings, and empathy is the whole story. So feelings, when you get so wrapped up in someone else's distress, it's sympathy, and it's actually not really helping anyone. And that's where people get burnt out, I think especially sometimes in healthcare professions, because there's just a lot of sympathy and it's not in a way that's helpful. But empathy is, I'm getting the whole story, but I don't have to live in it with you. I just want to hear about it and help you resolve whatever may or may not need to be resolved. Sometimes people just need to tell it to you. And especially, I don't think I have this on the slide, but it seems relevant for what we're talking about. It's the whole idea about just saying thank you. When somebody tells you something unbelievable, you should believe it. I have a whole nother line of literature on the dark side of leadership, and I've looked at a lot of dark side destructive leadership situations in universities, and inevitably they happened because colleagues wouldn't believe something bad about a colleague. So it doesn't mean you need to agree at the moment, but if you hear something about sexual harassment, instead of defending your good colleague who you've never seen do it, you should just believe that they said that and take some time to consult with your colleagues to figure out how to handle it. So you can look at the Nasir situation at MSU, you can look at the fake paper classes thing at UNC, you could look at the stuff that happened at Penn State. Every time people knew, and I said, but Steve's not that kind of guy. So really thinking about, especially if you hear things from underrepresented folks about things that have happened to them, to believe it, because that's also what creates that emotional, psychological safety, and help them then resolve it. It doesn't mean that you need to fix it, but it should mean that you believe their experience of it. And this idea of the deeper meaning behind people's words is really what empathy is about. Because when people feel that you're empathetic, then they're much more likely to want to connect with you and be motivated by interacting. I want to pause for a moment before we talk about so much time. So much to do. Let's just talk a moment about positive emotions. Anyone familiar with Barbara Fredrickson's work out of UNC? She's done a lot of work actually with health outcomes. The positivity ratio and the Broaden and Build model. I see a couple of head nods there. The idea is, I didn't put her beautiful model, I should have put it up here. The idea is that the more you experience positive emotions, your horizon opens, you're able to take in more ideas. Versus, we've all heard of, when you get tunnel vision, because you're stressed, so you get really focused on down, and you don't see things that happen. In psychology, we even have cool experiments, selective attention. Some of you may have seen it. There's people in white and black shirts bouncing a ball to each other, and you're supposed to say how many times they bounced it, but then a person in a gorilla outfit walks through, and they don't see the gorilla. That's tunnel vision. You're focusing on one thing. Positive emotions helps people be more willing to take risks, have confidence. It builds their capacity for resilience. And one way to do that is expressing gratitude. I noticed how you all were responding to the presentations this morning, and that's so important. Like, thank you for doing a good job. Thank you for getting up here and telling us things. These seem like little actions, but they actually add up to matter something. To express gratitude, it's free. It's incredibly free, and we don't do it nearly enough. Like handwritten notes to people. I was impressed that you did this. So building those positive emotions, or I love the kudos idea, we're bragging on somebody else, builds the capacity for people to take on hard, difficult problems, which is part of what mentoring is really about, is helping them to try hard enough to fail at something. And so building that psychological resilience really matters in that regard. All right, I've just given you a whole lot of information in like 45 minutes. So I want to pause and ask what questions you have, and we'll kind of wrap up with what's one thing you think you might do differently. So we have time for a couple of comments or questions, or people sharing maybe some other things they do that they think is effective. Yes, Julius is coming your way.
I'm quick. Thank you.
I'm just curious if you have any suggestions on books or podcasts or other places to learn more about the things you've talked about today.
Yes, I think I put something. I put it at the end. Yes, I will. Julius will help me figure out how to share some of this, because these are some really good resources. Brad Johnson writes a lot on good mentoring, including one of his books he wrote for men to mentor women. But I read it and I called him up and I said, well, actually, I learned things. So I think he's a very good writer. and the positive emotion stuff. So there are some resources. I'll make sure you get that.
Thank
yes.
you so much. Appreciate
There,
it.
I haven't found any podcasts that I'm wild about. They're just like returning, like, as a colleague of mine in England said once, he was trying to recruit me to be a consultant. And I'm like, well, I'm busy being an academic. He goes, well, but most American consultants are content free. And I feel like many podcasts on mentoring are content free. So, but I'll add something to this. Jean Rhodes out of the University of Massachusetts has some really nice resources. She's focused on youth mentoring, but actually sometimes those things really apply to other settings.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes.
Might be one of those difficult conversations that come up as a mentor. What if you have, none of my mentees that are in the room, by the way, this applies to.
Except for you. No, I'm kidding.
They're all great in this room. Sometimes you set goals with them and they keep coming back and they haven't really accomplished those goals. And have you ever terminated your relationship with a mentee and said?
Yes. I call them graceful exits.
Okay.
And we need to learn to help people have graceful exits. Yeah. Because sometimes it might be like, look, I feel like maybe I'm not meeting your needs. Why? And I try to be very specific because we've talked about this and there doesn't seem to be progress. So I'm wondering if maybe this is my aspiration for you and maybe you feel you need to go in a different direction or a different approach. Let's talk about who would be right for you. Sometimes when I've had that conversation, they've said, no, you're really right for me and here's what's been happening, why I didn't do it, and we try to get a plan to get on track. So their disinterest was just general life dysfunction. And actually among new faculty members, it's really common, 25% in some of the studies I've done. We did some work on new faculty mentoring. And they had weird dysfunction, like their house would flood, or they had a spine surgery, or you know what I mean? I'm like, that's a lot of people, but people were interpreting their disinterest for other reasons. Other times they were relieved. They didn't know how to have the conversation, and they said, yes, I would love to explore, because it's like an invitation. Can I explore with you who might be a better fit? Because they're probably worried about offending you. That could have reputational consequences. So yes, I would have open kind of conversation about that. Yeah, and term it more like graceful exits. Let's find the right fit. I put in the plan in the beginning. Well, there's a couple things. I suggest that the first meeting always be treated as tentative. And that so the question was sort of at that first meeting, do I put it in a contract? So I always have the first meeting as, this is our tentative date. And let's talk about at the end. And I usually give them a week. I don't want them to decide in the meeting. You take a week. I'd like you to meet at least one or two other people. It depends on the setting. Sometimes that's an option. Sometimes it isn't. To feel like freedom. So it ends up actually sometimes the illusion of freedom makes them more motivated to work with you if they're not sure. But then after that, I put in check-ins. So rather than sort of graceful exits, it's like we're going to have check-ins to make sure this is still working for you. That's how I do it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sometimes the mentees' family problems spill over to the work or training. So some of the mentors are, involved in. Some of them are absolutely disconnected. But the majority of the time the mentee spends in work or in the lab, it's affecting the work productivity. So what is your suggestion for the mentors? How get involved or where do you draw the line?
That is such a great question. And people are going to draw that line at different places. So I know some faculty who feel their personal and professional life are completely separate. I'm married to an academic. Our life is all jumbled up together. We just live differently. People come to our house, blah, blah, blah. So we might find out more things because of that. I think what is important is to help mentors understand they're not counselors and they're not social workers. And knowing enough to refer students to those people who could probably better help them is an important skill. So sometimes it might be, hey, when it crosses this line, when you've moved outside of, when you're spending a lot of time on personal issues, there's a couple of options. Maybe the student needs a leave. Maybe they need some extra support. I had a situation this past year where they had a housing problem, like literally got kicked out of their apartment. It's a real thing. But we had a social worker on campus who helped them find housing. It wasn't my job to do that. So I think understanding enough, and mentors should be prepared enough to be able to refer. Even if they are clinical psychologists, their job in that setting is not to fix all of those issues. Just like employees have employee assistance programs. So it's a way to think of it. How much they're going to want to know might depend. How much they're willing to do might be a personal line. And this also has to do with social media. Some people want to be Facebook friends, some don't, which is different from, so I think the hard line is when it moves into counseling, that kind of spending a lot of time that's not in your job description, you need to let other people do that, but maybe your job is to connect students with those resources. Yes?
Yeah, so this may overlap mentoring and providing feedback, but let's imagine that we're not the primary mentor, but we've been asked to provide some feedback on a grant that's due next week. And it looks like it needs substantial changes and revisions. How do you provide that feedback, perhaps as a secondary mentor, and then potentially how does that relate to what you talk with the primary mentor?
That's a great question, because increasingly people are in these sort of what I would call co-mentoring sort of relationships. And I think making it clear, like, look, here's my feedback, but you need to check in with your primary mentor and see what maybe needs to really your most attention. So now you're still providing your honest feedback, but you're also leaving that primary person the room to deal with the person on what needs attention. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, I guess one other question is, if the grant's due in a week, do you temper your feedback and only give them part of the feedback you might have otherwise given them if they would have given it to you 3 months ago?
Do you want them to get the grant?
Yes.
Okay, I would give them all the feedback that you think is really important. And then part of the job of the mentor with the student is to parse out what needs the most attention. They might not be able to do it all, but at least they can then make it a reasoned decision that maybe I need to meet the next deadline, or maybe, right, because not to give it all.
Okay, but I like the idea of flipping it back to giving them all of it and then being able to talk with their primary mentor so that you're not the one who's pulling the rug out from underneath.
Right, you're not the bad guy. And I often might say, look, I would want to know this if I were you. So I've given you all of my legitimate feedback, which may not require all of your attention. And that's a conversation to have. So I think that's because you want to do it in a respectful way with their co-mentor. And I think part of it, so otherwise, here's what happens. They're like, well, you told me this and this person told me this, what am I supposed to do? But by referring it back, you've given them some room. We have time for 1 or 2 more comments or questions.
I was wondering if you had some general guidelines for mentoring people who are really involved in caregiving for others or trying to grow their families, which I think a lot of junior faculty were hitting them, when you're joining somewhere, you're in the throes of growing families and a lot of things that are time consuming, and institutions handle different and mentors handle differently. Are there some general guidelines that you could point us to?
General guidelines. Well, no. But I will say, I think knowing your institutional policies are important, especially if they're are they tenured track kinds of folks? Because different places have different rules about that. I actually just was covering, even as I started a new job, for a faculty member who just had his first child teaching, and he's feeling that squeeze. So I think knowing the institution policies, but then having them talk to someone who's been in that same situation can help them best navigate it, and hopefully having a conversation early with their boss about, because there are, so I'm going to retract my previous answer. There are also things about stopping the clock or family medical leave that they sometimes don't know about, and it's really important for them to know about. So the faculty member, for example, I just worked with, I said, you need to go on FMLA leave, we'll figure this out, and you should put in the maximum because you never know what's going to, like he's thinking the baby's due here, it's coming then. I'm like, no, that may or may, and it came a week early, she did. So I think helping them know that there are policies to protect them at the institutional level in addition to sort of those implicit what's okay. But I think that's when it's really important to have them connected with someone who's been in a similar situation, because the rules do vary. And it ends up, they did some research, it's very interesting, on stopping the clock for tenure, thinking it would help women. You know who helped more? Men. It helped men publish more because they actually had less caregiving responsibility while that clock was stopped and got more out. So sometimes policies don't always help who we mean them to help. You all have been really terrific. I hope, okay, so last thing is, oops, I went too far. Can I go back? I would like you just to write down one thing or tell somebody next to you the most useful idea that you got today. What is it, and who will you tell? I'm coming back there to you guys, so you just better get ready, okay? Are you ready? Will you tell us just tell us one thing?
I think for me specifically is every time I've talked to mentors, I never actually had like a plan or a goal set. So I think going forward, every time I plan to create a mentorship connection with someone, just having that goal defined as to what do I want out of this relationship.
Okay, that's great, and it'll help them know your intention. Yeah. Terrific. Can we have one other person share what your intention would be? Yes. You looked like you wanted to share.
I love the I am curious. I would like to use that more in my interactions with others versus the why.
Yeah, when I started doing that, I found it made a really big difference in how people respond. We have time for one more. Aren't you from Australia? I feel like we need the Australian. I love Australia. Australians like Americans. Except for you, maybe. I don't know.
As a mentor, checking in with mentees to determine whether their needs are being met. Like, is there something that they want to ask about, but for whatever reason haven't, and can we help fill that gap? So
I like that.
Be intentional about that.
Yeah, I have found by being much more intentional, sometimes they're like nothing, but by just having it the routine, when something comes up, they feel okay to say, hey, I really would like to do more of blah, blah, blah. You all have been fantastic. If you find any of these tips don't work, feel free to write me and let me know that. And I wish you all the best and really applaud your interest in intentional mentoring. I think we spend a lot of time in those activities, and having them be great and not just sort of average is why I do things like fly all the way to Kansas City. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Lunsford, for a great keynote and workshop and flying all the way to Kansas City. I hope we made the time worth the trip for you. Thank you all for being an engaging audience.